Hello and welcome back. Sorry about my hair. I did not take a shower this morning. Not that you needed to know that. But I'm glad to be back. I hope that this will be informative for you. Today I'm going to be covering myths of family and, more importantly, some articles that are related to that. I will go over what I have here, but I think at this point, most of the points that I'm bringing up are points that probably we had discussed throughout the semester, only in as different concepts. Sometimes we discuss class, sometimes we discussed race, myths of technology, and a whole of those things. Pretty much leading up to the idea that individuals live within this larger society and that this larger society has these cultural norms and ideas. And myths of family, I think I touched on quite a few times. This is the first section where we actually did it sort of in a more formal way, where we had articles that are directly leading to that one path. So I'll cover some of this stuff, but again, I think most of this stuff at this point in the semester would have been pretty obvious to at least some of you. So I'll just cover it now. Harmony at Home, I'm going to start there. So in this one, we have a section, Harmony at Home. It begins by representing a series of facts. Most of those facts are interesting to the point where um, they attack the idea of how we really perceive the family structure and the family unit, and how, well, attack may be a strong term, but it critiques, right, the idea of family. Maybe that's a little bit better. It responds to myths. So an understanding of these myths is pretty important to understanding how the critiques work, obviously. Because if you don't understand sort of the basis of the argument or the sum total of the understanding that we had about family units, or at least perceptions of family units, up until, probably the 60s, 70s, when things started to break down a little bit more, at least in the broader cultural perception, when maybe the comparison to the ideal family was not necessarily as unironic as it was initially. So this section gives you some facts, and this refers to the textbook, and some of the section basically that introduces the ideas. But moving on further, this is another just little basically summary breakdown with maybe some cute little graphics to help engage you. But when you're reading this again, or at least identifying these points again, remember that this was really just a setup for the unit itself and how there are various ways of attacking. Well, I use that term again, but I don't mean to. The critiquing the idea of the ideal family unit, because in essence, what maybe this section is arguing is that it's not as clear cut as it used to be, and the different kinds of families and the different kinds of units that make up what we would call family is actually much more multifaceted, even maybe even when these perceptions were being formed, right? These perceptions of the ideal family in popular culture. Maybe this has always kind of been the case. I guess the question you could ask yourself as you're looking at this is that has this always been the case, or is this just and this is just a recent sort of observation that we're all unique and that our units are unique, or was it or has it changed? Has the not only the idea but the actual structure changed? And I think statistically, it was certainly more common. The ideal family unit that they describe was certainly more common in maybe the 50s or 60s, and then 40s and 50s maybe, than it was later on. But the shift, in perception maybe matches the demographic shift, or, in some ways, maybe the demographic shift was pushed along by the change in perception, meaning, like divorce, right, became more readily accepted. Maybe not, accepted in the sense of, it's nice or good. But in some cases, maybe it is, right? Maybe that it's sort of a necessary thing. But whereas before it was sort of you were cursed to be divorced. You were cursed if you were divorced. That's just one example, like adoption maybe was a little bit more uh, widespread. Certainly, interracial marriage became a lot more accepted by the popular culture, and even laws changed to that extent. And you could kind of fill in the blanks from there, right? The different aspects of how culture changed either followed the demographics, or the demographics followed the cultural changes. And then this is probably a little bit more abstract in that it identifies ways that our perceptions were affected by, and by we, I just mean the American perspective, right? Was influenced by aspects of the founding itself. Okay, so this section also identifies things in there as well. And again, this is all in reference to that little introduction. Pretty heavy on facts. It's actually pretty useful in framing any questions that you might want to make, that you might want to work through on family. But moving on, and I should have probably had this up. But moving on, as you can see, I'm scrolling through, and I have a lot of messy stuff here. But let's move to when should a child be taken from his parents? This is a direct reading from that section. And I basically subtitled this Counter Narratives on the Family. And that was kind of my best way of understanding this in the context of the unit itself, because that introduction identified ways that we could look at the family unit and the demographic and cultural changes. This one is again, if we're to look at it from the perspective of an argument and its structural makeup, this is kind of it plays on the pathos, I suppose, and rhetorically, and it is a series of points of view, buttressed by some statistics, okay, in terms of how things actually work versus how people work through the system. Some initial questions that I think transition us from that larger idea of the change in family units is the systems that are in place to sort of take care and promote the family unit. This whole process, what happens when it breaks down, essentially. What responsibility do we hold? So we're not talking anymore about that ideal scenario. We're really in the weeds about the specifics of this change, right? And more specifically, even within that, how the breakdowns are treated, right? When we have this larger idea of family and this thing that we want to promote, and as far as the idealized scenario of happy kids, happy parents, units, that are constructive and useful. There has to be a system in place for when that breaks down, right? And that's one of the central questions, I think, that transitions us from that larger idea to the more specific readings. So initial questions: is the system fair or unfair? What is due process? Again, that term again, Fourth Amendment that we were talking about before. What kind of regulation is needed for children in danger? This article covers most of those ideas, but we can plant those questions in our head as we move forward. Okay, sorry about that. That's a fly. It starts with a first-person account, and again, back to that effect. When I say effect in parentheses there, it's again where what that does to us as a reader, right? Both rhetorically and as a structural choice, right? The argument itself begins with kind of a quasi first-person account, but if you read the essay, it does change, right? The point of view shifts. It goes from the idea of the person that's stuck in the system, the parent maybe that did quote unquote wrong, and it shifts to the investigator, right, who has a different set of assumptions that they have to work from. And then it eventually starts moving into the ways that the judge, right, decides these things, right? So we have essentially we have three different points of view that we're discovering, in a sense, as a reader. We're discovering the parent's perspective that's caught in the system, the investigator, and the judge. So along with those points of view, it's not just sort of a sympathetic portrait of, look at this person and the struggles that they have. There are actually some reasons for this, right? It's because this article is at least trying to understand the difficulties in creating a system where these different competing interests must come together, right, and be taken into account. So in the first case of the parent, you have the preponderance of evidence, right, which is a pretty low standard, right? It's just, does it seem like this is the case? If so, then we need to safeguard have the safety. It's not beyond all reasonable doubt, right, which is a criminal investigation. In a criminal investigation, for those of you that are amateur criminologists or maybe even professional criminologists, for all I know, that's a pretty high standard to hold, right? It's like, beyond all reasonable doubt. You can even have unreasonable doubts, like, I don't know if this person actually did it, but I can't really pin it on anything specific, but I gotta let him go because I haven't proven anything, right? I have to prove everything to the point where nobody can really question my assumptions. But in the preponderance of evidence, one of the reasons why that's so important is that this is not a criminal investigation, right? So the standards for it are lower, right? The idea of preponderance of evidence actually puts the onus on the parent in some ways, right? It's like when the investigator comes in, they have to just, if they see something that it's like, it's 51-49, we kind of have to go with it, right? We kind of have to either remove we have to remove the children, or in a worst case scenario, or we have to assume that there's something going on here, right? That's kind of, that turns it into sort of a quasi criminal action, but even worse than that, if you want to call it worse, depending on your perspective, there's a balance there to be struck, right? So there has been one of the other things that this article talks about is the change in the law from just throwing them into foster care, throwing the kids into foster care while the system works itself out, to an adoption, which takes away even a few more of the rights of the natural parents, right? Because the assumption is in America, at least, that the natural parents do have preeminent rights, right, to take care of their kids, right? That's one of the things that we think is good, at least in the abstract. But in the specific, when the natural parents are the ones that are actually being investigated, when you throw them in foster care, it's sort of a holding pattern. But one of the changes that has occurred from the 90s and on is that adoption has been seen as a better route, which is, of course, even taking the rights of the natural parent further away, right? Because adoption is a more extreme solution in the sense of taking kids away because that's more permanent, right, than foster care, which is a sort of a holding pattern. So those are some of the things that it brings up, and I think I'm going to use, if I do family, I'll use this one as a way of approaching these different perspectives and points of view. Basically the battle between these competing interests and sort of how that works itself out. I think that might be a good way to explore that structure, that kind of argument. Okay, so that's the family, myths of family. I will, if indeed I do wind up putting the next section, it'll probably be just a little bit before I do that, because at this point, this is kind of where we started to diverge in terms of the schedule. Sorry. Okay, so that's what I got for you right now. I will post this and you will see it, hopefully. And if you have any questions, definitely let me know. I'll see you then.